It's interesting how you say the question of the end of things, because I think like it makes me think about how is our economy constructed and how we consume the space, the question of waste, the question of derelict, of also marginalizing people. So, and the idea of end echoes that actually. The fact of something that is not ending, or something that is looping, makes you think that nothing is waste.
Are we recording? Welcome, Lina. We're truly excited to have you here. This is actually our first podcast episode, and it's truly a pleasure to have you as our first guest.
Thank you so much.
We would like to firstly just start briefly mentioning the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and send our condolences to the families affected and unaffected. As a Turkish person, I feel the most responsibility to mention these events. And in a few ways of donations, we will include the links in the description. You can donate to AFEX, which is a local source who are on the field and is very effective and trusted. Coming back to you, we know that you're Lebanese, and we wanted to quickly ask if your family is all well, or if you were affected in some way, and also ask, knowing how dire this situation is, and if you've had the time to contemplate, where do we go from here? How do we build a city that has been flattened, or a region, both literally and figuratively?
Thank you for this introduction, and I also join you to feel this empathy to all the lost people during this natural disaster and earthquake. It has been really chattering to see all the lost people and the situation that is there, and people under the rubble. And of course in Lebanon, it's part of the region, so people did feel it, and thankfully all the family is good. But of course, I mean, it's traumatizing, because Beirut has been living so much trauma, and when things like this happen, you're like falling again into all the instabilities that are permanently happening. What we can do is already help immediately by donating, and of course by thinking also short-term and long-term as architects, how can we deal with such situations. And that brings you to question how we build in our environment, how do we build for resisting disasters, or at least for being more resilient during such times, and how do we build to react to such context also? How do we anticipate such situations? How do we build to be resilient? Is by building more consciously, by being responsible in this context, and understanding the place where we are building. So when we are building in a seismic city or in a seismic context, our construction techniques have to be different. We have to be more wary about the movement of a structure, and listen sometimes to ancestral techniques as well, because when we look at some of the techniques in the past, where we used to build with stone and kind of accumulate between a stone and a wood structure in between, we used to think about the movement of a building. This is more in a vernacular way, let's say, but also today thinking about concrete structures, thinking about like how we build in Tokyo, where we have buildings that move completely. They are padded, so they are able to move with the earthquakes and actually resist as much as possible such events and reduce the losses. That is brought up immediately when we see such, photos and such retransmittance of these events where people are really completely under the rubble. So build more with more consciousness and think about it in a more resilient manner. And of course, then you think about how to house the people that are all now just finding themselves without home. whether from such a natural disaster, and sometimes also from wars or from such conflicts. So can architecture be thought also as a transient form of construction, how to assemble more quickly, think about materials that are assemblable, disassemblable, that could be really be able to host people in such times.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to see you speak in Rotterdam this past summer at the World Around conference, and the theme was this idea of precarity, which I think sort of relates to the context we find ourselves in now. Do you think that architecture is poised to deal with crisis as it is, or do you think that it's kind of unprepared? And if so, how do we sort of adapt? How do we change?
I think like at the moment when you look at how much architects build, we're not building a great majority of our built environment, unfortunately. And I think if we have more architects and we're given more power and we claim more power to think of our environment, I'm sure we will be having much more impact, because we're as architects brought up to be critical thinkers, to be feeling the times and being able to anticipate the problems. We have the tools, we have the capacity of thinking materials, of being close to materials and thinking of what materials are the best in such a context. Of also, we are innately passionate about our environment, about space, about the well-being that architecture could have to the population. So in a way, we're thinking about the well-being. So if we have we have to be more activist in our environment, and we have to be more given the tools to do that. So I do think that we are able to, in a way, through our construction, to anticipate more such situations through building resilient structure, but also building more climatically responsive and more conscious constructions, like thinking about a building that is more responsive to its climate, like for example thinking about the project that we're doing in Normandy, like this manufacturer that reduces its need and consumption. So in the case we have a scarcity in energy, we're always thinking about an autosufficient construction rather than a building that is consuming in its environment.
Do you think that there is room for sort of architecture to kind of grow in terms of, I suppose, it's the onus of the built environment, given that you said that it's quite an irrelevant or obscure part of the building process or building all around the world? Do you think that there, or how does that, how do we claim that space?
We claim that space by taking forward our tools as being at the crossroad also of disciplines. We are a specialist of our own discipline, but we are also partly also part of politics, the politics of the city. We are also part of the economy. We have to be dialoguing with economists. We have to be dialoguing with politicians. We have to be dialoguing with different professions, and we have to be present in a diverse manner in the world. We're just not talking only to a small portion of an elite that is just interested about architecture. And by trying to show how impactful a good architecture can be on the well-being of people. When you're in a good space, you're more comfortable. You're also kind of prone to be a better person. And when you're in a violent space, in a violent city, you're rather a violent being. So space affects how we are, affects our behavior. So we have to voice out the impact and be present in more, let's say, fields than just architecture, to make this, to make people more sensitive about it and grow the architecture culture.
this position we're in as an industry, you said cross words of different worlds. How do we, knowing that as also students, thinking about this idea of these different worlds, being able to relate to and learn about different fields at the same time, can be seen as a blissful, like a very beautiful place to be. But at the same time, I feel like when architects come into the professional world, it can also be a place of struggle, and where there's so many things to juggle at the same time, so many different agents to talk to. How, in a world where architects seem to be losing some of their voices in the middle of all of these crises, how do we make sure that how do we stay optimistic in knowing that our profession can actually make an impact? As students, we would like to believe so. How do we keep that optimism when there's so many crises around that force us to feel a certain type of way?
Yeah, but you know, architecture in its DNA is about dealing with this complexity, and that's what's fascinating about this profession. It's about dealing with contradictions all the time, dealing with the complexity of the world, and trying to render this mostly accessible and intelligible and livable in a way, and render and sublime actually that complexity into something very positive, because complexity is positive. It's about like bringing diversity together, bringing diversions together, and kind of giving this richness that is the world, that is actually reflected even in nature and biodiversity. So somehow when you're doing a project, you're not just thinking in your own bubble, and that's maybe the schism that happens between moving from the academic world into the actual reality on the terrain of architecture. Because when you're studying, you're on how with yourself. It's kind of an auto, let's say, a work on yourself, like kind of exteriorizing your design approach. But suddenly, when you're in the built, like in the actual construction and architecture world, you're suddenly realizing that you have to build with engineers, you have to work with, and you have to organize their work as well with economists, you have to work with constructors, you have to deal with the client, and you have to deal with the politics of a project, because suddenly a mayor or a politician or a city, they don't want this project. So how do you draw a vision? And that's what's fascinating. So you're in a way like architecting, you're really bringing people together into one space, and it's constantly either a virtual space where they come at a consensus, or it becomes a real space where people meet together and kind of transform their relationship through the consensus that you as an architect were able to lead and bring forward. And as such, we are optimists. We're constantly optimists. We're the optimists that through, at times of crisis, we see opportunities, we build new relations, because crisis means also a transformation, means that there's a time of change, things are happening differently. It's no longer possible to continue on the system as it exists, and there is a new system or something new that has to emerge. So we can see, for example, today with our awareness on the climate, with all the changes like the disasters that are happening that are also linked to the climate, that we have to respond differently. And this is not new, it has been for decades now. Yeah. So it's just urgent to do it. And this is fascinating, because as architects we can lead the way into that as well.
I think talking about disasters, your project Stone Garden had a bit of an interesting fate, let's say, where the fact that it survived the explosion in Beirut. How do you think it kind of added or took away from the value of the building? Do you think the dialogue between what happened during the explosion, how the city is being rebuilt? Because the building was actually under construction at the time, right?
Yeah.
During the explosion. And I think in one of your interviews you mentioned that some people thought the project was almost like came out of the explosion in a way that like it was actually constructed after the explosion, but it was actually started before.
Yeah.
What kind of meaning do you think it attached to the building, the explosion?
I think like the project in a way deals with this question of destruction of especially more war-torn like cities, because in Beirut the city was reconstructed so quickly, the city center. In a way it lost the memory of what had happened, and sometimes when you're scarred, when something happens, you need time. You need time to you know, to heal. You need time to look at what had happened, who inflicted the scar on you, and how can you resist that? How can you also stop going again to the same problem? So, and in that sense, Stone Garden attempted to look at the scars of Beirut and externalize them, maybe through the built form of that project, without becoming just a gimmicky approach to you know, like a bulleted building. It's really taking that and transforming that into a way of living, of creating different apartments, different living within that building. So in a way, it tried to create a narrative. It's as if you're healing by talking in a way. So the building is talking to the city, is allowing people to talk, to wonder, is it actually an opening, or is it like talking about what had happened to the city? So in that sense, somehow the talk is happening. It's a narration that is essential to transform, to heal, and to do things differently. And then, of course, it's about like being able to resist. Like at the time of the explosion, the building was almost finished, so we were all actually delivering the building, and then the explosion happened, and then the whole shell was resisting that explosions, because it's also designed to a seismic country or city, so it's really resisting any shake. It has limited openings that are also climatically responsive to the place. So in a way it's resisted that, but it's also kind of reminding us that it's designed to that context in a resilient manner. It's one response to such a context. Is not the only response, of course. I mean, one has to think, listen to the place, and try to see how can architecture be an eminence of its environment in a way.
And so projects like Stone Garden they've had another life in the form of exhibitions. And I think as a magazine, we're also interested in how your architecture communicates, and given that you have been sort of active within the exhibition world, I suppose, both in sort of the designing of exhibitions and your models being part of those exhibitions, what do you think the role of exhibition making is in architecture today?
That's a great question, because I think exhibition is not just reproducing a project, like exhibiting the project, is trying to like use the exhibition as a tool to tell more, actually, to narrate a context. And maybe the project itself, like for example Stone Garden, in that sense we did a model of the building, but used this model to become itself a standalone element that is able to talk its own life and to narrate within the interior of the model a whole life that is about Lebanon, about artists in Lebanon, about the world that is happening in such a context, about the mishap of the city itself. So the tool, the exhibition becomes a tool to as much talk about the process of making, but also involve people in architecture and be able to provide an experience, an immediate experience, not just like a drawing. I try always to like break from the aseptic or like kind of representational approach of architectural exhibition. So it's not an art, it's not like just showing like a drawing and looking at the drawing and not understanding as an individual what is this drawing is too technical for me. It's probably a reverse to what I said. It's an art form. It's really an emotion. It's trying to get into it, like get into the interiority of what an architecture is and what was the process behind and what does it mean. How can I feel a piece of what exists in reality here through the exhibition? I think it was interesting, for example, in the exhibition in New York of Designing Peace, and where the model was exhibited, is also how this exhibition tells about the architecture being a tool of resilience, of really transformation. So responding to your earlier question also, Yusuf, so how can it become a tool of transformation, of optimism at the end? In Rome, it was more like throughout history, talking about different architectures throughout time.
I guess pavilions can be seen as a sort of exhibition and something that attempts to create an emotion, let's say on a bit of a more intimate level. And you are the designer of this year's Serpentine Pavilion. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired the pavilion and what emotion would you like to express with this year's pavilion?
Yeah. I mean, the pavilion emerges, first it tries to talk about our time, where our need is to be anchored, to come together actually, to come together around one place, one table, and think about our relationship to our environment, how we relate to our environment through the way we eat, but through the way we talk, what we agree together to, and come together under one roof. One roof that is expressing the context in which it sits, these canopies of the trees, that is built in a modest way and that looks at the heritage in which it sits, that respects the elderly, let's say, serpentine structures that exist, the galleries there, and also that is as sustainable as possible. So it's a low carbon construction, it's a wood construction, it's mountable, dismountable. So it's kind of a place, a human place also, a place for the living. So that's what mainly inspired the project of the pavilion. And its ability to be mounted quickly and dismounted and maybe reused somewhere else. I'll tell more also about it when it's open.
Oh, right. The stuff you can't say yet.
No, but yeah, you'll see all the details when it's constructed.
It's very exciting. It's very exciting.
I hope you.
And I think as students, we've typically seen certain, or usually it's older, grey-haired, sort of white men. That's kind of our frame of reference in terms of understanding what an architect is and who an architect is. And this moment in time feels quite exciting for people who aren't that. For instance, in the Biennale circuit, there are many women of color coming to the fore in terms of directorships. Do you think that, what do you make of this kind of change that's happening?
It's a breath of fresh air. It's essential. It's like breathing. You need to, diversity is so essential. We are diverse beings. I mean, the more we are diverse, the more we intersect, the more we are intelligent, actually, even biologically. When you cross different people coming from different ends, the kids become so smart. So in a way, we need this diversity to develop and to move on. So it's so evident. It's a must. It's not a luxury. It's just a must, and it's urgent to have this diversity and to see different voices and to learn from different ways of making. To learn from our past, how we used to make things, and I think somehow we tend to think, oh, in the past we used to be more primary, or we're more rudimentary, and actually we were quite smart, how we used to relate to our environment, how we used to build. So how do you learn from what we had done, how we listened to an environment, how do we bring that with the technology that we have today and push it forward? So kind of embracing the world, its diversity, and rather connecting to each other in a continuous porousness instead of building walls.
I just like, were you at the Jeddah Biennale? Did you go to that?
Yeah, I went there.
What was your impression? It was the first time it happened?
Yes.
I mean, it's a Biennale in a context that's never had an architecture Biennale.
Yeah. Yeah, it's art biennale. Yeah.
Oh.
Islamic art biennale.
Right.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting. It was really nice because it's kind of a context that is pushing to open and to kind of show its culture, and more specifically here around the Islamic culture is really understanding the embedded elements of this culture, the spiritual side to it, all the processes and through different art forms. So I thought this was really immersive, and it's quite fresh, kind of, you know, bringing other voices into the world, and that's really enriching and inspiring.
Yeah, this year with our issue, we want to explore, let's say, a little bit of a more negative sounding concept, which is about the end of things.
The end of things.
The end. And we want to frame it in a way that's about the end and other things that may change throughout time. So when you talk about this rebirth, this change, and this, let's say, a new chapter, although the end and the apocalypses and crises may sound quite negative, it is our reality, and we want to explore how we get used to these things and how we live with them, but at the same time how we can find the optimism again, to find a way out of them and to learn. And like you said, crises are a moment of exploration, of redefinition. How would you, are there any aspects to your practice relating to, for example, archaeology of the future and understanding design through archaeology? What are the aspects of your practice that we can take inspiration from in terms of how we can learn from our past and implement it in our today to, let's say, find a new path, find something slightly more optimistic and positive?
It's interesting how you say the question of the end of things, because I think like it makes me think about how we perceive of how do we how is our economy constructed, and how we think, how we consume the space, the question of waste, the question of derelict, of also marginalizing people. So, and the idea of end echoes that, actually. The fact of something that is not ending, or something that is looping, makes you think that nothing is waste, that actually everything is a resource, and everything that happens is about regeneration at the end. So I think the question is, how do we, maybe it's the end of consumption, it's the end of of kind of over accumulation, it's the end of the thinking of an endless world. Right. But it's the thinking of a circular economy. It's thinking about how cyclical everything is. It's the thinking about that no one should be wasted. No one should be marginalized. Everybody is a resource within a circular economy. So in that sense, it's interesting to figure out and to think as new generation, what are the new devices that we can build, actually, where everything and everyone becomes a resource within that mode of thinking, where it's about sharing, it's about really kind of a common intelligence. Let's be utopic. Yeah. We should be utopic, because it's the way forward too. And in that sense, in a non-linear way of thinking, it's about learning also from the past. It's digging. So it's kind of, the archaeology is about that. It's about, like, you start to look for things and suddenly you discover a piece, and then you're thinking about what story had existed there. You build your story, but then actually you discover more about the reality. So trying to reproject that in the future, and linking to that cycle, linking to what in indigenous society knew how to live in an environment. If you think about how they used to inhabit an environment, they would settle with these long tents and one land and crop and plant, and then the next season they just move in another place, so leaving the land to rejuvenate. So you learn about how do you inhabit an environment. And I think also with all the crises that we will be living with, all the instabilities and probably maybe the disaster that will happen due to climate change, that also obliges us to think about living at risk. So how do you live in a moment where everything is constantly at risk? So there's the notion of stability is different, so continuity. So you're more closely actually living the instability of what nature would like inflict on an environment. So you have to have different responses, and you have to also act in a different manner.
So this idea of learning from the past, your buildings are increasingly, they have or apparently have sort of traces of the human hand, and you kind of employ artisans more readily than any architect I know today. And it feels like the cutting edge of architecture, the way that we think of it, is kind of like jagged edges and hyper-futuristic glass. But what do you think the role of the human hand is today in the sort of building paradigm that we're in?
Yeah. I think in one sense is to bring more this relationship, or like this conscious relationship that one has with the environment, in a way when you're building by hand, or when you have the hand in a way traced in a building, you have this kind of an inner relationship that is suddenly present between us as humans and our environment. We're more close to the living, and that's very important, I think, for me at least. And I think also the hand, like thinking about the hand even in more, let's say, more systematized ways of construction, means also assembly, means also any person can hold the material and assemble and construct. So it's also again being able to maintain your environment more quickly, and being able, even if you're in an industrialized process of construction, being able to know how to construct. And that brings us back to the question of crisis management or post-disaster. Can we think about how can people do their own spaces and construct, and the result would be like beautiful? Because beauty is essential too, that you need to be in a beautiful place to feel respected, to feel dignity in relation to where you're living. So the hand is really like a thread. It doesn't mean that it's against technology. It's kind of, we worked with technology through our hand too, but it's kind of being conscious of that link that we have with our living environment.
It's a very organic way of approaching architecture, almost like, in a way, like a farmer in a very old century would harvest their own hay. Where I come from, in Anatolia, they used to build with mud brick, which is mud and hay. This way of building with your immediate surrounding and almost harvesting it, and being self-sufficient in your built environment as well. How does this play into the modern way of construction? How, for example, in Stone Garden, you implemented this artisanal hand on the facade, on the outer envelope. Are there other ways of implementing the human hand, and how can we, standardize, almost like make it widely available for the people again? How can people go back to using their own hands? Yeah,
that's what I meant just now. It's different manners of doing it. So one way is, as you're describing, just like planting your own material, but it means also empowered with knowledge. Like when we used to build our houses with stone, I mean, people would know how to build with stone, you know, because at the village you would be close to the mason, and when you wanted to build a house, even if you're not an architect, you know the basics of masonry, so you could actually direct and work with the mason or with the architect and the mason, so you are knowledgeable about the material. So this culture of the material is quite important. Probably today with so much, you know, kind of the material technology like scares the common people. So you're just unable anymore to know what are your building constructed with. So suddenly, if you have a leak or something, you're just kind of helpless. What to do? What do you do? Yeah. So it's about knowledge also. It's about like rendering the building technology more accessible, and maybe the materials themselves more accessible and manipulable by common people. Actually, how do you what do you do when things you need to assemble in a certain way? And on the other side is also having this relationship with the local resources. So, for example, building this atelier in Normandy is really identifying what are the materials that you can use. You have the earth there is like very good for bricks, so just maybe using bricks and manufacturing bricks and building with bricks. So somehow creating a circular economy out of your research that you do on your territory. And of course the challenge is always between the exception, what you are able to do as an exception on a building, and the widespread and on a larger scale, how to make this common and accessible to a larger building industry.
Considering that we are coming to the end of our interview, I would like to tie it back to what we are trying to do here, which is we are trying to run a student-run magazine, and I wanted to get your opinion on talking about the spread of knowledge. Magazines are a very specific way of transmitting and expressing knowledge, but in our day, considering how fast we need to consume information, what do you think the role of magazines are? And do you think there are ways we can incorporate our current, let's say, technologies? Or how can we approach magazines maybe from a new, fresh perspective?
I think what will be great, because I think it's a great initiative, is really being more hybrid, like not only tackling architects and architecture, like if you're talking about material, go see biologists, go see physicians, go see reach out other, and talk about architecture through that also. Then it becomes a very rich terroir, ground for thinking and for moving forward. It's not, we need to kind of talk to each other and not think about separate disciplines, to be able to move forward together also and transform the way we inhabit the environment.
Sure. I think, now that we're coming to the end, I just want to say that it's quite easy to feel sort of ambivalent about the future, I think, today, given the many crises, but I think this conversation has maybe animated a little bit of optimism in me.
Don't be negative. Are you really feeling negative as students, rather?
Maybe you have realized through this interview we're trying to shape our own thinking of the future. Let's say we're doing our own archaeology of the future. But I would like to say it's been truly a pleasure, and this is our first time, so we would like to apologize if there was anything
it's fantastic,
that
really.
Was out of line.
Not at all.
It was truly a pleasure. Thank you for
Thank you so
coming
much.
Here
really nice to talk to you, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we actually have a small gift for you.
Oh, really? Wow.
Our
that's sweet.
And a small letter from us.
Thank you so much. Wow. So that's the last issue.
This is the last one. Yes.
Oh, nice. Wow.
And what we do is we take a bit of a wider theme, and we frame it through a phrase, a sentence. And this year, this issue was about time, and we frame it through the sentence "Ours through a still frame."
Yeah.
And we do try to talk to different professions, fields.
Great, bravo.
And bring together something that is a little bit more fresh.
Beautiful. What do you think the role of architecture will be for the future?
The role of architecture?
The role.
The role.
I learned from you.
Do you want to answer this question?
Well, I don't know if I'm qualified, but I think, I suppose the reason I was attracted to architecture in the beginning was because it dealt with kind of complexity. Like there are so many things that it kind of touches on. And I think our tendency today is to be sort of allergic to complexity. So I think, yeah, the role of architecture in the future is like sort of communicating complexity in a way that is approachable. Yeah, I think that, like, at least that's what I'm most interested in.
Nice.
I think the magazine for me is a great example of it, which is bringing these ideas that are maybe left isolated within our bubble to anybody who would be interested, and making these ideas more accessible through different formats and mediums. And I think what's beautiful about architecture and everything that it encompasses is that when you can communicate these ideas on a much more welcoming manner, everybody is extremely interested in them, actually. For example, the things that you were talking about, being self-sufficient in your own house, in your own home, these are things that people actually would get excited about. So for me, it's about creating that excitement about being able to repair, to construct, and to think about our world and everything, both physically and figuratively, how to construct and architect our own reality. I think that's something that everybody would feel stimulated by.
Yeah, fantastic. That's inspiring. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.